Hello, Joe O'Connell, Sandpiper Pump. Today we're going to do a rebuild of our HD20F. Out front we have our Sandpiper Genuine Parts wet-end kit and air-end kit. We'll be utilizing these kits in our rebuild today.
Identifying which kit is required for your repair has become easier on newer pumps with the permanently affixed metal serial number tag that now indicates the wet end and air end kit information for the pump. Kit information can also be found in the service and operating manual. Sandpiper Genuine Replacement Parts, wet end and air end kits provide a bill of material of the components included in the kit. All items included in the kits are components that Sandpiper recommends replacing when rebuilding a pump. The pump we are using today is an example of the ease of kit installation. Always consult your respective service and operating manual before performing any maintenance on your pump. Service and operating manuals include composite repair parts drawings, repair parts list, and torque specifications. For service and operating manuals or more information, visit us on the web at sandpiperpump.com. Always remember that safety is the highest priority. When working on or around any equipment, always follow the correct safety procedures. Always read and follow the safety warnings and instructions in the service manual before any work is started on the pump. For more information, see the Warren Rupp video on safety at sandpiperpump.com.
The rebuild you're going to see is accurate in man method and machine, but for video purposes, some parts of the work performed have been condensed in time. At any point during the presentation, please pause this video until you've completed any part of the process. The pump we're using in this presentation today has been built new and is considerably easier to work with than a pump that has been used in a process. Additional time may be required for the preparation and separation of parts and components during the rebuild. Okay, let's get started. Today we're going to use an impact gun for the ease of maintenance, but all the work performed can be done with simple hand tools. So we're going to go ahead and start by taking off this module right here. Great feature about this is this handle can go on either way. As you can see, this handle's on this side. This handle can go this way or this way.
Once you have the cap screws off, you can now remove the end cap. With the end cap removed, you can access the flat valve assemblies. Using an Allen wrench, go ahead and remove the flat valve assemblies, suction and discharge. And behind each flat valve assembly is an O-ring. Go ahead and remove those O-rings and discard them. Spin the unit around, go ahead and remove the opposite side. Again, remove the cap screws, the end cap, the flat valve assemblies, and the O-rings. Once that's done, you can go ahead and remove the outer chamber on one side. Start by taking off the hanger bracket on the suction side. Then you can go ahead and take the bolts off the chambers. Then we'll go ahead and remove the bolts out of the leg bracket. Once you have that done, you should be able to separate the outer chamber from the inner chamber. It may take a screwdriver or a pry bar, but just lightly pry it loose. Those are O-ring seals on the manifolds. You can go ahead and discard those. Next, we'll take the diaphragm off. When removing the diaphragm, one of two things are going to happen. You're either going to remove the diaphragm assembly from the rod, or the rod is going to come loose from the opposite diaphragm assembly, like happened here. Go ahead and take the opposite side off now. You see, we'll separate that. You'll have diaphragm assembly and then the two manifolds connected to the outer chamber. Go ahead and remove those. Take the O-ring seals off and discard those. Now we've completely unassembled the wetted side. Now we'll take the inner chamber off the intermediate. Go ahead and remove the 4 screws holding the inner chamber to the intermediate. Once you have those screws removed, there's a gasket underneath. So go ahead and remove the gasket and discard it. We'll set the inner chamber down, and we're going to use that as a base because we still have our actuator plunger sticking out there. So we'll use that as a work base, making sure that we stick the actuator plunger down through a hole just to have a stable surface to work on. And go ahead and remove the opposite chamber. Discard the gasket. Now we can start working on the main air valve assembly and the pilot valve. So remove the main air valve assembly. And then go ahead and remove the pilot valve. That's the air inlet cap, so take the 4 screws out, remove the air inlet cap, and that'll give you access to the pilot valve. The pilot valve came right out there. And then you can also remove the actuator plungers. Once you have the actuator plungers out, you can set the intermediate down. You want to go ahead and remove the star ring, the bushing, and the O-ring that the actuator plunger slides in. Don't forget the O-ring in the very bottom. And you can go ahead and remove the U-cup. Flip the unit over, complete the same procedure on the opposite side. Removing the star ring. Discard that. The bushing. Here we're going to remove the U-cup, and then the O-ring in the very bottom of the receiver. With that completely disassembled, now we want to disassemble the outer and inner plate from the diaphragm. So go ahead and put your inner plate in a vise. Make sure that you grab around the bottom of the inner plate and not on the radius. You can go ahead and separate the components. You may have to unthread the diaphragm from the stud on the outer plate. Then we'll go ahead and start to take the diaphragm rod off the opposite diaphragm assembly. Remember, when we separated the 2 components, one still had the rod on it. So what we want to do is use a set of soft jaws. Soft jaws keep the diaphragm rod from getting scratched or nicked. You don't want to nick or gnarl the diaphragm rod when you separate it. So use a set of soft jaws in your vise. Go ahead and clamp the diaphragm rod in. Once you do that, you should be able to separate the assembly from the rod. Then you can go ahead and remove the diaphragm rod, remove your soft jaws, and we can separate the assembly again. Sticking the inner plate in the vise, make sure you grab hold of the lower portion of the inner plate and not up on the radius. Go ahead and separate all the components, loosen it up, unthread it from the inner plate. And again, you may have to unthread that diaphragm from depending on chemicals that you've been using, they may cause the diaphragm to swell or stick to the outer plate. Next, we're going to go ahead and disassemble our main air valve assembly. Remove the 4 wood screws that hold the muffler cap on. Remove the muffler. Then on the back side, you'll see a U-clip. Take a small screwdriver, go ahead and pull that U-clip up and out of there. And then we'll go ahead and remove the end caps. We're twisting the end caps. It's not threaded. It's held in by an O-ring. So I'm just twisting it to help remove it from the body. And once we have the end caps off, you'll see that there is the sleeve and spool. Go ahead and remove the spool. Take a deep well socket, set it down on the table, one that's big enough to push the sleeve out while fitting inside the bore of the main body. If you're replacing the airing kit, these components come together. Now we're ready to start our reassembly. Go ahead with our airing kit, and in our airing kit we have a main air valve sleeve and spool, pilot valve, gaskets, O-rings, retainers, everything you need to rebuild the air side of the pump. So let's inspect our intermediate. Go ahead and anywhere where you find gouges, you can clean them up with emery paper or sandpaper. Next, we're going to put in our actuator plunger O-ring into the actuator plunger receiver bore. That fits all the way down in the bottom of that bore. You want to make sure you get it seated in there flat. Put a little grease on there to keep it from rolling or catching or binding once we install the actuator plunger. So now we're going to put our bushing in. It should just slide right in. You may have to clean that bore up depending on if you had a diaphragm failure. Next, we're going to put on our star ring. Remember, the open face of the concave goes up. You want to center it in, and then you want to make sure that the wings of the star ring fit below the lip in the bore. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing on the opposite side. Again, put our O-ring in, put our bushing in, and remember our star ring is concave and you want the open face of the concave to face up. So you center it in the bore, push it down, then you just want to go around and make sure each wing is seated below the lip in the bore. Next, we're going to take our U-cup. The open face of the U faces up. So we're going to put it in the receiver. First, we're going to put a little grease on the U-cup. Again, the reason we use grease is to keep things from binding, catching, tearing, or ripping during assembly. Put a little grease on there because that's where the diaphragm rod will go through the U-cup. Remember, the open face of the U goes up. I'm going to seat it in there properly. Next, you want to take your gasket and put it on the intermediate. Remember, you need to align the open ports with the actuator plunger and the air port. Next, you want to put your chamber on, aligning the actuator plunger port and the air port. Install your 4 screws. Make sure you do it in a crossing pattern, and then you want to torque those in. You'll find torque specs in your service manual. Now we're going to go ahead and do the opposite side, install the chamber. Make sure you install your U-cup first. Open face of the U-cup goes out. then your gasket. Remember to align the actuator plunger hole and the air port on the gasket and the inner chamber. If you don't line those up, you will have a problem. Let's go ahead and install your screws. Torque them in. Make sure you do it in a torquing pattern, bringing the chamber down evenly. Next, you want to install your actuator plungers through the port where the pilot valve goes. Remember, it looks like a little nail. The head of the nail should be going into the port so we can push it through the hole in the port. Putting a little grease on there also so that we're not catching or binding those components as we assemble it. You always want to grease those things just for assembly purposes only. Next, we have our gasket for our pilot valve. That gasket is non-directional, just like the pilot valve. You can put the gasket in the pilot valve. Then you put the air inlet cap gasket on, again, non-directional. And the air inlet cap. Doesn't matter which way you put it on, all of those components are non-directional. Go ahead and tighten up the bolts in a star pattern, bringing it down evenly. Next, we're going to go ahead and replace the O-rings on our end caps. So go ahead and remove those O-rings, the old O-rings. New O-rings are included in the kit. I'm going to take our new O-rings, we're going to put a little grease on there so that we don't bind, catch, or tear the O-ring as we're assembling it. There's 2 O-rings to each end cap. Make sure you get them in the proper location. Once you get all the O-rings on both end caps, you can go ahead and put the O-rings on this sleeve and spool. Once you get the O-rings installed on the end cap, we can go ahead and install one end cap into the main air valve body. Install that, and then we'll go ahead and put our O-rings on our sleeve and spool. First, we want to grease the O-rings first. Go ahead and install them on your sleeve and spool on the sleeve, making sure that you get each O-ring set in the correct position. Using grease to ensure that we don't roll, cut, nip the O-ring once we install the sleeve and spool into the main air valve body. Each kit comes with a packet of grease used for assembly. Once we have all the O-rings in, you can just go ahead and push the sleeve and spool in, twisting it, pressing it, twisting it, so that you're not nicking or cutting the O-rings. You want to do that slowly. And go ahead and stick your spool in and grease the O-rings on the other end cap and slide the end cap in. The sleeve will self-align. Install our U-clip retainers. And go ahead and reinstall our muffler. Make sure you clean the muffler before reinstalling it. Now we'll put the main air valve body to the intermediate. Remember, this gasket is one directional. You have to line the holes on the gasket with the pilot valve ports in the main air valve body. So again, this hole has to align with that hole. Making sure that you align those holes, then you want to align those holes with the holes in the intermediate. Once you have the holes aligned, go ahead and install your screws, tightening them down in a star pattern to ensure that you bring the main air valve down evenly. You want to go ahead and make those mechanics tight. With that, the air side is complete. Now we're going to go ahead and start our wet side. First, we want to take our inner plate. You want to put your hands on it and check it for any cuts, nicks, gouges. You can dress those up with sandpaper or emery paper as long as you maintain the radiuses that are in the plate already. Next, you want to install the inner plate into a vise, making sure that you grab the lower portion of the plate. Then the diaphragm. Remember, the natural bulge of the diaphragm goes out. Then the wear pad, and then thread in the outer plate, and you can assemble all those together. Then make sure that you torque the outer plate to the inner plate. Torque settings are found in your service and operating manual. Once you have that assembly torqued together, go ahead and repeat the same process on the opposite assembly. Inner plate, diaphragm, wear pad, and outer plate. Thread the outer plate in and then torque the assembly together to the call-outs in your service and operating manual. Once you have that done, you can go ahead and torque one assembly to the diaphragm rod. So go ahead and grab the diaphragm rod in the vise using your soft jaws. Again, you don't want to gnarl nick the diaphragm rod. Thread the assembly onto the rod and torque it to the called out manufacturer specification in your service and operating manual. With that completed, you can go ahead and replace the flat valves and the hinge pads on your flat valve assembly. So removing the nylock nuts, you can remove the retainer, the hinge pad, and the flat valve. Clean up the seat. You can dress it up with sandpaper, emery paper. Now take a flap. The L portion of the flap faces down, and your hinge pad is concave, and you want the open face of the concave to face down also. Then your retainer is L-shaped. You want that to face up. Take your nylocks, thread them on about hand tight, and then you want to flap the flap a little bit, and you want to check your flap. You want to see how flat it sits against the surface of the seat. If the bolts are too tight, the bottom of the flap will hang out. If the bolts are too loose, the top of the flap will hang out. You want to adjust the bolt nuts until you have the flap sitting squarely on the seat. You're dealing with rubber components, so you do have to, there is not a torque setting. This is a sight setting that you need to continue to work with until you get the face of the flap sitting squarely against the face of the seat. Again, too tight and the bottom of the flap will hang out. Too loose and the top of the flap will hang out. You want to go ahead and repeat that procedure for all 4 flaps. Next, we want to go ahead and install our diaphragm. Don't forget to install the bumper. One of the main things that's always forgotten is installing the bumper. So, put your diaphragm on, line it up with the bolts. Next, we want to line up our chamber with the top of the pump. Remember, the top of the intermediate, top of the pump is the nameplate. So you want to put the suction side up and the discharge side down. Once you do that, get a couple of bolts in place to hold the chamber down. Tighten those bolts down in a star pattern, bringing the chamber down evenly. Next, you want to put on your manifolds. Place your O-rings on the manifold, the sealing rings, and go ahead and put a little grease. Again, we don't want to bind, nick, or cut that sealing ring as we install it into the manifold, into the chamber. Go ahead and put the bolts through for our hanging brackets. And we'll go do the same thing for the opposite manifold. Doesn't matter which one you start with. You can start with the suction side or the discharge side. The manifolds are universal. They can be suction or discharge. Just remember, when you put the sealing ring on, you put a little grease, and that you put on the discharge side, there's 2 sizes bolts. You have a large bolt, a long bolt, and a short bolt. I'm going to take the short bolt and put it through the manifold. And the long bolt will actually go through the chamber. Put your leg bracket on. Remember, the L kicks outward. Put your short bolt in. And then you're going to use your longer bolt to go through the chamber. Go ahead and flip the unit over so we can put the other bolts in. Remember, the short bolt goes in the manifold and the long bolt goes through the chamber. Now we'll go ahead and thread on our opposite diaphragm assembly. You may need to invert the diaphragm to get it onto the rod. Just simply invert the diaphragm, as shown here. make sure you put your bumper on, and then go ahead and thread that assembly onto the diaphragm rod. Once you got that, what you want to do is you want to torque that diaphragm assembly to the diaphragm rod, ensuring that once you do that, you line the bolt holes up. Always go forward, never go backwards when torquing. Next, we want to put our sealing rings on. Again, put your suction and discharge on, applying a little grease to the sealing rings to ensure that you don't bind, nick, or cut that sealing ring as you're assembling the components. And then you can install the outer chamber. Remember, flat valve units are top suction, bottom discharge, so make sure you put the suction side up and the discharge side down. The larger ported side of the pump goes up, the small hole port goes down. Remember, your nameplate is up. So we'll install the chamber. Go ahead and push that assembly together. Get a couple of bolts in to hold it all together as you assemble the rest of the components on it. Go ahead and tighten the bolts up a little bit and then tighten them down evenly in a star pattern. Again, we're going to put our leg bracket on. Remember, the short bolt goes through the manifold, the long bolt goes through the chamber. The L faces out. On the top side, we've got one bolt that goes on each side that goes through the hanging bracket. Go ahead and tighten those on. Go around, make sure all the bolts are tight. Next, we're going to install our flat valve assembly. So first you want to install the proper O-ring in the suction and discharge side. Then your flat valve assembly. Remember this, on the suction side, the flat valve assembly faces in. And on the discharge side, the flat valve assembly faces out. Do that for both sides. Now you can put your end cap on. We have a gasket. The flat face of the gasket faces up. The ridged portion of the gasket faces down into the end cap. The end cap is designed that it can only go on one direction. So if you have the flaps reversed or if you have the end cap reversed, it will not go together. Install your 2 screws on the top and the bottom, and then decide which way you want to install your handle, either vertical or horizontal. Either way, it does not matter. Then complete the same thing for the opposite side. Again, the ridged portion of the gasket faces down into the end cap. It will only go on one way. Install your bolts and your handle. Now your assembly is complete.
That completes our wet end rebuild of our HD20F. For more information, find us on the web at sandpiperpump.com or contact after sales support at service.warrenrupp@idexcorp.com.